Welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Center of Everywhere podcast. I'm Marnie Werner, and I'm the Vice President of Research at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. We are a private, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in rural Minnesota where we are dedicated to providing data-driven research on rural issues to help our policymakers make more informed decisions affecting the rural people and places of our state. And today, I'm with my colleague, senior researcher Kelly Asche, and we're going to be talking about our annual State of Rural Minnesota report. So, hi, Kelly. How are you doing?
Hey, good, Marnie. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to talk about what I found this year.
Yeah, you were digging up all sorts of interesting information and data, the new data that's coming out. This is a report that we do every year, basically at the end of the calendar year. And so we're just going to be releasing it this week. And we were talking about this earlier, that often every year when we do this, we have the trends. We look at population, we look at economic trends, we look at trends in agriculture, and things don't change that much. You know, they may go up 1%, down 1%, something like that. Nothing very dramatic. This year is totally different. And there's some weird disruption things going on because of the pandemic. What's going on?
Yeah, this was a pretty fascinating research project for this year. Like you said, usually the State of Rural is something we do kind of at the end of the year. You know, it's approaching holiday break. Everybody's at home, no one's in meetings and no one's answering email. So it's a really great time to just kind of dig through all the updated data that got updated by all of our sources, you know, be it the Bureau of Economic Analysis, labor statistics, or the census. They all have updated their most recent data. So it's a great time to kind of dig in, update all of our data and kind of figure out like, all right, what did we see? There was a couple of interesting things that made this year particularly, I think, unique. So one was when we did this last year, we were just coming out of the pandemic, and a lot of the secondary sources that we use from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the census, all their data was delayed. So there wasn't much to update last year. There was not a lot of new data. And so this was the first year in which we actually got like 2 years of data over the duration of 1 year. Because they kind of caught up. So they caught up from the pandemic years and they caught up to where they should have been anyway at this time. So it was a really interesting point in that. And due to the pandemic, the data itself, the migration trends, the economic trends, just some of these things that have been kind of long-standing, slow-moving trends are all of a sudden occurring at a much higher, quicker, faster rate than we've typically seen in previous years. And so usually it's this project is, you know, about tweaking some words here and there, changing 1% or 2. And this is the first time in quite a few years we've had to rewrite entire sections because we've had a total 180 in the typical trends that we've seen. So migration was the big one. And I don't know if we want to dig right in or how you want to proceed, but that was probably the biggest surprise.
Well, usually when we talk about population growth and migration in Minnesota, we're talking about natural change and migration. Those are the two drivers of population. Natural change is basically births minus deaths. There are parts of Minnesota where you have more births than deaths, and so the population grows there. You also have parts of Minnesota, often in the more rural areas, where you have more deaths than births. And so you have a natural population decline. But then you have migration, and there are people who are moving into the state, people moving out of the state, and then people moving around in the state. And like what you were saying, oftentimes it stays pretty steady. But this year, we saw a lot of moving around in the state, and it wasn't for the usual reasons. We have people migrating to the metro area for school or for jobs. We have people migrating to the lake counties in north central Minnesota for retirement. That didn't happen this time. What was going on?
Yeah, so it was really, really fascinating to look what the data that we look at is called the components of change, and it's produced by the U.S. Census Bureau, and it's using population estimates, and they have modeling and survey work that they do to produce these kinds of estimates. But they break it down into two reasons why populations change, right? You either have natural change, so you have more births than deaths, which means you would have an increase, or more deaths than births, so you have a decline in population. And the other driver is migration. Do you have more people migrating into your area or out of your area? That then impacts a region's population numbers. And there were two kind of main things I'll talk about when we looked at these numbers. The first being a huge 180 in migration. So between 2010 and 2019, our more rural areas of the state typically saw a decline in migration. So you saw this kind of slow trickle out migration. So the net migration in our rural areas meant more people were leaving than coming in. So between 2010, 2019, our most rural areas saw a decline of about 276 people per year due to out migration. But between 2020 and 2021, they saw an increase of 518. Like just a total 180, right? So not only is it not declining, they're in the positive, but they're in the positive by like 3 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's huge. We saw this in our town rural mix counties. So counties, we're using our rural urban commuting area codes here. So town rural mix, between 2010, 2019, they typically saw about 1,000 people annually net out migrate from their counties. They saw an increase of 2,600 people between 2020 and 2021. Our urban town rural mix annually between 2010 2019, they saw a positive, but it's only like 200 people per year of people in migrating. Between 2020 and 2021, it was 5,500 people. And then the real kicker are entirely urban areas. So this is a 7-county metro plus some our urban areas in greater Minnesota, like Blue Earth County. They typically saw an increase of in-migration annually of 11,000 people. Between 2020 and 21, they saw a decline of nearly 20,000. So these are completely opposite numbers of what we saw between 2010 and 2019.
But when you separate out those greater Minnesota urban counties, because those counties are like Blue Earth County, St. Louis County with Duluth, Olmsted County with Rochester, Moorhead, East Grand Forks, Stearns.
Yeah.
When you take those out and you compare those to just the 7-county metro area, what happened there?
Yeah, really interesting. So we're going to call them entirely urban outside of the 7-county metro. They actually still saw in-migration gains, not at the level that they've seen previous years. It was like between 2,000 and 3,000 people between 2020 and 2021. It was a 7-county metro that lost 20,000 people due to out migration, a net out migration of people. I mean, just really fascinating numbers. I get excited about this because when we look at trends, Marnie and I, we see these numbers and they're always really slow, right? Like these trends just kind of, if anything's changing, it's a slow change. You might see something declining and then kind of plateau and then this kind of slow increase. You rarely see just an event that disrupts something so much that all of a sudden you go from a negative to a positive or a positive to a negative over the course of 1 or 2 years, right? Like,
and by
that's
that
crazy.
much.
By that much, exactly.
Yeah, that's significant.
So, we kind of wrote in our state of rural that anecdotally people have been saying they're seeing these things change. They feel like they're rural communities. There's more people moving in. You talk to real estate agents. They've been talking about seeing more interest in living in more rural areas of the state. And the data finally confirms, I think, what everybody's kind of been feeling and maybe seeing. And so that was pretty exciting.
Yeah. So what are the implications for rural communities to see these kinds of numbers? What do local officials need to be thinking about?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is that one, understand your own narrative. Are you a town that's dying? Is it the fact that nobody wants to live in your town? I think you really got to start questioning the prevailing narrative that has existed for quite a few decades now in terms of the desire to live in our rural small towns. And it's worth noting too that kind of going back to the migration change, it wasn't just in our recreational lake areas. We were actually seeing counties that are largely agricultural, Renville, Candy, Ojai, Southwest Minnesota, like counties there that were seeing increases in their population that have seen declines for 20 years ongoing. And so we actually have counties that since 2010 have had a lower population since then than they had in 2010, all of a sudden shift. And now they have a higher population than they did in 2010. Huge change. I bring this up because, again, going back to that narrative, I think a lot of the ongoing trends have shown that, well, people just want to live around lakes or, they like the recreation. I think this is starting to show that people actually just like a small town for maybe just quietness or slower pace of life, right? Affordable housing was probably a big piece. So from a leader's perspective that live in these communities are thinking about these things, I think you got to be thinking about, one, how are you promoting your area as a place to live in? Because now rural areas are being looked at in the marketplace as a place, a desirable place to live. So how are we promoting it? Do we have housing stock for them? Do we have childcare for these people? And then how are we connecting these people that are moving to our rural areas with the local jobs? Because there's probably too this kind of dilemma in which, yeah, people are moving to our rural areas, but they kept their jobs in the Twin Cities and are working online. So that's not going to help our job vacancy statistics, or the number of jobs that are available in our area and to help our employers. So I think there's a lot of things to think about. And again, I think it's our ongoing message to everybody in Minnesota is stop thinking about economic development in terms of how do we get more jobs and start thinking about it on how do we take advantage of this trend of people moving to rural areas.
Right. And just talking about jobs, we saw a big change with job vacancies too, right? Or not a big change, but like a kind of a big blip in the trend.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. We've been talking about job vacancies for years, and they've been high for a long time, particularly the job vacancy rate, which again, for people that don't know, the job vacancy rate is the number of jobs available divided by the total filled jobs. And so the higher the percentage is kind of like a good measurement on how difficult it's going to be to fill those jobs. And I think what we saw in 2020 is you kind of saw like we had high job vacancy rates and then they took a little bit of a dip. So they were around 5, 6, 7% in each of our regions around rural Minnesota, a job vacancy rate around 6 or 7%. And again, we consider 3% to be healthy.
Yeah.
And then the pandemic hit and there was this dip and it didn't go negative. Like it didn't go below 3%. It was still at like 3, 4%. So still like what we would consider healthy or high, but it did dip. And then when it opened up in 2021, oh my goodness, it's just, we have regions now that are hovering around 10% job vacancy rate, which is absolutely insane. And again, I think it just came to, a lot of businesses got shut down. There was a lot of uncertainty. People were laid off for a little while there. And all of a sudden things opened up and people had money in their pockets. The economy just took off. It roared, which is kind of one of the reasons we have high inflation right now, right? And employers were looking higher. They needed people production up again to get things distributed, to serve people. And then you had healthcare and all these others that were trying to hire, and it was crazy. And I think it still is pretty crazy.
Well, with vacancy rates, up at 8, 9, 10%. Yeah, that's kind of crazy. When does that get to be a crisis point, for the local economy?
I don't know. And I think this is something that, we probably need to do some research on, but I think a lot of economists haven't quite wrapped their head around yet. This is the first time that, I don't know, I can think of, maybe Marnie, you can think of a time, you're more of a history person than I am, of when we've had more jobs than people. I don't know on a statewide level.
Yeah.
There may have been little pockets, when the mines opened and things like that in the history of the creation of Minnesota when there was more jobs than people and we were having immigrants come over. But this is the first time where like systematically across all occupations, across all industries, we have more jobs than the people that are trained to do those jobs, or the just flat out the number of people that even fill these jobs, and trained or untrained, right? And so I don't know what this looks like in the future. I think, we're seeing wages increase. Again, we saw that in the state of rural. Wages continue to increase. I think definitely in response to employers trying to fill these positions. So that's good to see. Labor by far has the most leverage / power that it's had, I don't know, modern day history that I could think of in modern times. I mean, I don't know. It's funny. I think anecdotally, we can all think about our friends who are like, oh yeah, we can just ask for time off now and we just get it. Like, they don't care. Like, yeah, you just don't quit. Don't leave the job. Whatever you need, we'll make it work, right? So economically, I don't know. Like, wages keep going up. Inflation is tough. Productivity is going to be slow. We're going to continue to see things, not entirely stocked on our shelves, I think in the foreseeable future anyway. It's just going to be a different way of living. I know they keep talking about recessions and economic downturn, but I just don't know, and I don't think anyone does, what that looks like in low unemployment.
And the recession thing, it really depends on who you ask or who you're listening to. Some people, do the whole sky is falling thing, and others are like, well, we might, but it won't be big, and
I think it's, and I get the sense too, it's people either accept that we're in a major transition period. And granted, this is a period that I think we've been talking about, not we, but like this old state demographers in Minnesota have been talking about for 20 years now, maybe longer.
Right.
This was coming. The baby boomer generation is going to leave the labor force, and there's not enough people to continue the economic growth, particularly when you shut off the faucet for immigration. And I'm going to rail on immigration policy forever and ever until somebody fixes it, because it's insane to me that we have an economy that needs more people if we want to kind of have the quality of life at the prices that we wanted for a long time. But moving forward, I mean, so I think there's economists that understand we're in a major transitional period, and that not necessarily the sky's falling, but things are definitely going to change. It's going to look different moving forward. Economic growth, what we expect that percentage to be, is probably going to be a little different. And then there's the people that, like, if it's not how it's always been over the last 40, 50 years, the sky is falling. That's kind of the sense I get, right? Like, you're either like open to the change or not.
Well, some people handle change better than others.
But
that's the way it's going to be. And, we just have to ride with it, and it's, so we do still have, we do still have lots of jobs in rural Minnesota. One thing that we noticed that may or may not have been something affected by the pandemic was you saw a shift in the top employers around the state, right?
Yeah. So for many, many years now, education and health services has been the top employment industry across Minnesota, both 7-county metro, northern Minnesota, and southern Minnesota. Health and education services typically makes up 20 to 40% of employment in a county. So it's a big sector. So we expect that to be in a majority of counties across the state. And then there is always these little nuances. So in northern Minnesota, we would typically see leisure and hospitality be a top employer in quite a few counties. I would say around 7 to 10 counties would have that as their top employment industry. But in 2021, there was a shift, and leisure and hospitality is only the top employment industry in 2 counties now, which is very different than it was 2 years ago or pre-pandemic, where it was, like I said, closer to the 7 counties. And again, I think that's probably due to the pandemic. It's probably 2 things, right? The pandemic really hurt some of those industries, but I also think just competition for labor. I think the increase in wages and health, I think even in the service industry in general, if you're not able to keep up with wages, as probably many kind of tourist type sites are, you're probably hurting. And tour, leisure, and hospitality just aren't going to be able to compete as a top employment industry because, you're fighting for labor that can pay, with other industries that pay a lot more. And so it's so easy for somebody to be like, yeah, see you later, waitressing job. I'm going over here to get, double my money per hour and not have to deal with people. That's kind of a no-brainer. So I believe it's that. And then the third thing I would probably say is that I think tourism hospitality, particularly in northern Minnesota, where they depend a lot on visa workers, that got shut down pretty hardcore during the pandemic, where they weren't allowed to get as many as they usually did. So that probably hurt them as well. It's like, well, if we don't get visa workers, there's no one to turn to. So we're just not going to employ anyone. So I think we saw a couple things there. But outside of that, farm employment and also manufacturing, trade, transportation, utilities continue to be top employment industries, particularly in the southern half of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then, you mentioned farm employment, but also we track self-employment, which is called non-employers with the Bureau of Economic Analysis. That just means that there are businesses that don't employ anybody except the owner. And those always tend to be higher in greater Minnesota, right?
Yeah, I find it continues. I mean, this is a trend that did not get disrupted at all by the pandemic. It's one of those that stays very consistent. And I find it fascinating because I don't think a lot of people understand that rural Minnesota, our most rural areas of Minnesota, have a really high percentage of total jobs. So if you took all the jobs and then the number of those, not the number of those, but the number of self-employed as a percentage of the total jobs in the region, it's always really high in our entirely rural areas. So the most recent data is 2020, it was 14.5% of the total jobs in our entirely rural counties are non-employers, which is really interesting. Where in our entirely urban areas, it's closer to 10%.
Okay. So it's just all those little one man, one woman businesses.
Yeah. And you see it significantly higher in northern Minnesota, where you have 17.5 to 20% of, if we were to add the total jobs and the total number of self-employed folks, the percentage of that is 17 to 20%.
Cool. And then we have agriculture, and agriculture is always a roller coaster, especially when we're looking at ag income. What was new or different with that?
They've been relatively I would say over the past few years, their expenses have been a little bit higher than their income. And so they've been operating at a net loss, kind of like 2 out of the last 3 years, right? Like the last 2/3, like since the peak in 2012 and 2013, they've been kind of going back and forth. It's been a little bit up and down, but it hasn't been extreme, which has been good. And over the last few years, they've been seeing a nice net income where the cash receipts that they've received from production is higher than their expenses. And that's good to see. And it's been a few years of that now. And I think some of the government payments over the pandemic helped. I think there was, the people were worried during the pandemic how that was all going to shake out with the ethanol plants and the rise in prices, having to slaughter pigs because we couldn't get them to the butcher, right? So there was a lot of concern about like, oof, man, our ag industry could take a hit. And you know what? It stayed all right. And they're doing okay. It's not like, I'm sure not every farmer is doing great, but at least we're seeing at a statewide aggregate level, things being okay. And I think that's actually, one, we got to give credit to the government for making sure that market stabilized and stayed well. I don't think the government and the support systems in place get enough credit for making sure egg markets are somewhat stable, particularly during a pandemic. But as well as, credit to our farmers figuring out how to navigate this whole situation, particularly with supply chain issues and stuff like that. So kudos to them.
Yeah. So what's the big takeaway from this year's report?
Well, I think this is a perfect storm. It's a combination of the pandemic and demographic shifts that we've been talking about for 20 years, all occurring at the same time and having a pretty disruptive impact on long-term trends, like trends that we've been seeing for 20 years no longer being the same, right? Like, and I think the big takeaway is one, yep, we're seeing that now. We've been talking about it for a few years now, and now we're really starting to see it in the data. It exists. This thing is happening. I think the other thing though is like, how will this continue? I'm really curious to see over the next few years, will this change in migration, stick, or was just this kind of a blip? Will this change in employment? Is that just a blip, or is that going to continue? So it'll be really interesting moving forward what this looks like. And I'm kind of excited for the next few years.
Cool. Well, great. Well, that is our State of Rural Minnesota report. We're going to get it up on the website this week. You'll be able to find it at ruralmn.org. And that's it for this episode. Thanks a lot, Kelly.
Thank you, Marnie.
You've been listening to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.